At 6:47 a.m., I turned my phone back on after 3 days of silence. 132 missed calls lit up the screen like an indictment. No one had called on my 60th birthday. But the moment I froze the bank account, they called nonstop as if I'd committed a crime. That night, my son stood at the door, his voice cold. "Are you really destroying our lives over such a trivial, pathetic dinner?" I looked at him and finally understood. I had never been a father. One small thing before we start, leave me a comment and tell me, have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you love? Yes or no, I'd like to know. I read more of your words than you'd expect, and I'm thankful for everyone. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The message behind it, that's what I hope stays with you. The phone had been off for 9 hours, and when I turned it on at 6:47 on a Wednesday morning, 132 missed calls lit up the screen like a fire I'd started and walked away from. I stood in the kitchen at 2847 Wheatfield Drive, with the coffee maker gurgling behind me, and scrolled through them one by one. Brennan, 31 calls. Roxanne, 28. Garrison, 47. Lori, 11. Brett Prescott, my son-in-law who'd never once called me on my actual birthday, 8. Christine Brennan's wife, 7. I counted them the way I used to count inventory at the shop, methodical, no emotion, just numbers on a page. Not one voicemail asked if I was okay. Not one text said, "Dad, are you hurt?" or "Dad, did something happen?" Every single message was a variation of the same sentence. The card was declined. Roxanne's came in at 11:47 p.m. Tuesday night. The card was declined at dinner. Fix this. No question mark. No please. Brennan's hit at 9:31 p.m. "Dad, what did you do? Call me back now." The capital letters told me everything about who my eldest son thought he was talking to, not his father, but a malfunctioning ATM. And Garrison, my middle boy, 47, calls between sight and 4 a.m. the last text at 2:14 reading, "Dad, pick up the phone. This is an emergency." I set the phone face down on the counter and listened to the coffee finish brewing. The kitchen smelled like Folgers and the lemon cleaner I'd used on the counters the night before, and through the window over the sink I could see the first gray light hitting the yard. Peggy's eucalyptus tree moved in a breeze I couldn't feel from inside. When did I stop being their father and start being their emergency fund? I poured the coffee into the blue mug with the chipped handle. Peggy's mug technically, though she'd been gone 4 years and I'd stopped calling things hers. And I sat down at the kitchen table and thought about Saturday. 4 days earlier, September 6th, my 60th birthday. I'd made the reservation at Maggiano's in Oakbrook Terrace 3 weeks in advance. Table for 12. I'd told Brennan, Roxanne, Garrison, and Lori in the group chat. I'd told them twice. Brennan said he'd be there. Roxanne said, probably. Garrison said, wouldn't miss it. Lori didn't respond. But Lori was 29 and lived in DeKalb, and I'd learned not to read silence as refusal with her. I arrived at 5:45 p.m. wearing the gray sport coat I'd bought for Peggy's funeral because I didn't own another one. The hostess walked me to a long table set with 12 places, white napkins folded into little peaks, 2 candles burning in the center. The kitchen had my cake in the fridge. Marcos, the young waiter assigned to our table, couldn't have been older than 22. Dark hair, polite in the way people are when they feel sorry for you, before you've given them a reason. Asked if I wanted to order drinks while I waited. I told him water was fine. At 6 o'clock, the chair across from me was still empty. At 6:30, I ordered bruschetta because Marcos kept coming back, and I could feel him running out of things to say. At 7, I ate the bruschetta alone and watched a family of 5 get seated at the next table. The father looked about 40. His kids fought over the bread basket. His wife told them to use inside voices. I remember the smell of garlic and butter coming from their table, and thinking it smelled exactly like the food I'd ordered for people who weren't coming. At 8 o'clock, I pulled out my phone and sent a message to the family group chat. "Dad's still at Maggiano's. Where is everyone?" 11 empty chairs. I counted them twice, like counting might make someone appear. At 8:23, Brennan replied. 3 sentences that I can still recite from memory, because I've read them more times than any man should read something that small and that cruel. "We're in Scottsdale. The resort has an event. Don't make a big deal out of it, Dad. Scottsdale. The Phoenician resort. I'd find out later. $650 a night." I looked at that message sitting under the warm light of a restaurant, where 12 place settings waited for people who had never intended to come, and I felt something shift in my chest, like a gear engaging after years of slipping. Marcos came back one more time. He stood at the edge of the table, with his hands clasped, and said quietly, "Sir, would you like me to box everything up?" I looked at him. This kid who'd been watching me sit alone for 3 hours, who'd refilled my water glass 6 times without being asked, who had more decency at 22 than my own children had managed in a combined 133 years of life. "Box it," I said, "and bring me the check. $340 for food nobody touched." I left Marcos a $60 tip because he'd earned it, and because I wanted at least one person in that restaurant to walk away from my birthday with something worth having. I drove home on I-88, with the boxes stacked on the passenger seat. The car smelling like chicken marsala and rosemary bread, and I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I pulled into the driveway at Wheatfield Drive and sat in the truck with the engine off, reading Brennan's message for the 3rd time. "Don't make a big deal out of it, Dad." The resort room he'd sent it from cost $650 a night, charged to an account ending in 7429. My account. The one I'd opened with Peggy in 2003. The one I'd added Brennan's name to after she died, because he'd said it would make estate planning easier. I turned the phone off, and I didn't turn it back on until Wednesday morning. I didn't go to bed that night. I walked past the bedroom, past the couch, past every soft place in the house that might have let me talk myself out of what I was about to do, and I sat down at Peggy's oak desk in the little office off the hallway. The lamp was the same green-shaded banker's lamp she'd bought at an estate sale in 2011, and when I pulled the chain, it threw a circle of warm light across the desktop, like a spotlight on a stage I'd been avoiding for 18 months. The financial folder was in the second drawer, right where Peggy had always kept it. She'd taught me the system before she got sick. Chase statements on the left, business credit on the right, receipts in the middle. I hadn't opened it in 6 months. I opened it now. 18 months of statements. I spread them across the desk, January of last year through August of this one, and I started at the beginning with a pencil and a yellow legal pad. Brennan's name appeared first. March 15th, $4,100 memo line reading, "Transmission repair." I remembered the call, Brennan's voice tight with urgency, Christine in the background, saying something about the dealership being closed. I'd transferred the money within the hour. 2 days later, Dorothy Patterson from next door showed me her phone at the mailbox. Brennan had posted a photo from a steakhouse in River North. Dry-aged tomahawk. 2 bottles of wine on the table. The timestamp was March 17th. I wrote the number on the legal pad and moved to the next one. Reading those statements was like performing an autopsy on my own family, every line item a wound I'd paid to receive. April. Roxanne needed $2,200 for Kieran's tuition balance. Kieran was at UIUC on a partial scholarship, and I'd already paid the gap in January. I called the bursar's office the next morning, and they confirmed no balance was due. May. Garrison asked for $3,000 to cover a plumbing emergency at his bar. The Iron Rail was a sports pub in Berwyn he'd opened with money I'd co-signed for, and plumbing emergencies had become a monthly event. June 8th, $2,800 to Roxanne for groceries for the kids. June 9th, her Instagram showed an omakase dinner at Nobu, Chicago. The location tagged the champagne visible in the corner of the frame. I kept going. July, August. The numbers stacked like bricks. Brennan's roof emergency of $8,500 in February matched a weekend at the Langham Hotel downtown. I found the confirmation email he'd accidentally forwarded to the family thread before deleting it. Lori's requests were smaller, more careful. 400 here, 600 there. But they added up to 4,400 over the year, and she'd stopped saying thank you around April. At 1 a.m., I put the pencil down and looked at the legal pad. The total across all 4 children, 18 months, was $74,200. I read the number 3 times. Then I said it out loud in the empty room because some numbers don't become real until you hear them in your own voice. On the corner of the desk, in a frame I'd never moved. Peggy looked at me from our 30th anniversary photo. I touched the glass with my thumb. You were right from the start, Peggy. She'd told me the year before the diagnosis that the kids were confusing generosity with obligation. I'd told her she was being dramatic. She'd given me a look I can still feel in my chest, not angry, just tired in the way people get tired when they've said the truth enough times to know it won't be heard. I slept 2 hours on the couch and woke at 7 with the legal pad on my stomach and the lamp still burning in the office. I made coffee. I ate toast standing at the counter because sitting down felt like it would slow me. At 8:05 a.m. on a Sunday morning, I called Chase Bank. The automated system tried to route me 3 times before I got a human voice. Patricia, the customer service representative who answered, had the careful patience of someone who'd processed 10,000 account changes, but could tell from my tone that this one carried weight. I need to remove all secondary account holders from my joint checking, I said. Account ending 7429. And I need a freeze on the business line of credit. $85,000 limit. Sir, that's a significant change, Patricia said. Are you sure you want to remove all authorized parties? I'm sure, Patricia. Do it today. 25 minutes. That's how long it takes to dismantle a decade of being someone else's safety net. 25 minutes of hold music and verification questions, and Patricia reading back confirmation numbers in her steady professional voice. When she asked if there was anything else she could help with, I almost laughed. No, ma'am, that's everything. I hung up and the house was quiet. Not the lonely quiet that had filled it since Peggy died, a different kind. Cleaner. Like the air after a storm passes through and takes the humidity with it. I walked outside in my slippers. September in Illinois, and the morning was cool enough to see my breath, but warm enough to stand in it. Peggy's tomato plants along the back fence were heavy with the last fruit of the season, and I picked up the garden hose and turned the water on low. The spray hit the soil and darkened it, and I could smell the wet earth mixing with the faint sweetness of overripe tomatoes that had split on the vine. The phone in my pocket was silent. I knew that silence had an expiration date. Somewhere in Scottsdale, in Wicker Park, in a bar in Berwyn, in a studio apartment in DeKalb, cards were about to be declined. Dinners would be interrupted. Transactions would freeze mid-swipe. And 132 calls would come flooding in, every one of them asking the same question nobody had thought to ask at Maggiano's. But that was Wednesday's problem. This was Sunday morning, and the water was cold on my hands, and the garden smelled like Peggy, and I wasn't ready to go back inside yet. The calls came exactly the way I knew they would. By Tuesday night, 132 of them had stacked up on my phone like evidence at a trial nobody had scheduled. Wednesday morning, I sat down at the kitchen table, turned the phone face up, and opened a fresh, ruled notepad. I drew 5 columns and wrote a word at the top of each one: angry, panicked, calculating, tears, silent. Then I started playing the voicemails, 19 in total. I went in order oldest to newest, pressing play and writing the caller's name in whichever column fit. Brennan's first message had restaurant noise behind it, silverware clinking, a woman laughing somewhere to his left. His voice was tight and clipped, the voice of a man more embarrassed than worried. Dad, the card got declined at dinner. Call me back. I wrote his name under angry and moved on. His second message dropped the pretense. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Brett had to cover the check. Call me. Roxanne left 4 voicemails. The first 2 were tears, the kind that come too fast and stop too clean, the kind Peggy used to call audition crying. The third was quiet fury. The fourth was a single sentence, "You're going to regret this." Garrison's messages were different. His voice cracked on the first one and didn't recover. 2:47 in the morning, a Wednesday, and my 32-year-old son sounded like a boy who'd lost his dog. Dad, please. The bank payment is due October 15th. $22,000. I'm begging you. I can't lose the bar. Please pick up. I wrote his name under panicked and sat with the pencil still touching the paper for a long time. Lori left 2 messages. Each one was 10 seconds of breathing, followed by a hang-up. I wrote her under silent. Then there was Christine. My eldest son's wife left 1 voicemail, and it was nothing like the others. No tears, no shouting, no begging. Her voice was the temperature of a conference room in January. Vincent. She said she'd always called me by a name that wasn't mine, and I'd never corrected her because Peggy said it wasn't worth the fight. My husband was denied credit in front of the managing partner of Harrington Logistics, a $2.3 million deal. If you have interfered with our finances, I will not forget it. I replayed that one twice. Not because it frightened me, but because it told me something I'd suspected for years. Christine didn't see me as Brennan's father. She saw me as a resource, and resources that malfunction get replaced. Her voicemail wasn't a daughter-in-law defending her husband. It was a boardroom threat dressed in family language. 19 voicemails. Not one of them started with, "Dad, are you okay?" Not one asked if I was sick or in the hospital or lying on the kitchen floor with no one to call. Every single message was about the money. Every single one. I closed the notepad and drove to the shop. Kowalski Auto and Fabrication sits on a half-acre lot off Route 59, and I've owned it for 31 years. By 9 o'clock, I was in the back office with the door half open, the smell of motor oil and brake cleaner drifting in from the bay, and the shop radio playing something by Fleetwood Mac that I wasn't really hearing. The notepad was on the desk in front of me when the shop phone rang. I picked up on the second ring because I knew who it was. "Dad?" Brennan's voice was different now. No restaurant noise, no clinking glasses. Just my eldest son in what sounded like a quiet room, probably his home office on South Wacker Drive, trying to sound reasonable. "We need to talk about what happened." "Okay," I said. "Talk." Brett had to call his father-in-law, the VP at Goldman Sachs, to wire us money. Do you understand what that looks like? Do you know what you just did to us? When did my son start sounding more like a collections agent than a child who missed his father? "Brennan," I said, and I kept my voice level, because the moment I raised it, I'd lose the only advantage I had, which was patience. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think about it before you answer." Silence on the line. "When was the last time you called me just to ask how I was doing?" More silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the faint hum of his central air conditioning, the sound of a man living in a climate-controlled world that someone else had paid to cool. "That's not," he started. "Just to ask," I said. "Not about money, not about the shop, not about the line of credit or the checking account or whether I'd signed something for you. Just to say, 'Hey, Dad, how are you?' When was the last time?" The silence lasted longer than any of the voicemails. 7 seconds. 8. I counted because I'd spent the morning counting things, and counting had become the only way I knew how to hold still. "This isn't fair," Brennan said finally. "I know it isn't," I said. "That's why I'm asking." He hung up. No goodbye, no threat, no promise to call back. Just the click of a man who'd run out of leverage and didn't know how to operate without it. I set the phone down on the desk and pressed my palms flat against the wood. The surface was cold and slightly gritty, with the dust that settles on everything in an auto shop, no matter how often you wipe it. Through the open door, I could hear the pneumatic wrench in Bay 2 and the radio switching to Tom Petty. Then Ray Gutierrez knocked on the doorframe. 45 years old, 18 years turning wrenches beside me, grease still wet on his hands, and a rag tucked into his belt. Ray knew my family's troubles better than any of them knew mine. He stood in the doorway, looking at me the way he looked at an engine that wasn't making the right sound. "Boss, are you all right?" I almost told him everything. Instead, I said, "Bring car 4 up to the lift." But Ray didn't move, and the look on his face told me he already knew more than he was saying. Ray didn't say what he knew that morning. He just stood in the doorway, a beat too long, nodded like a man deciding this wasn't the right moment, and went back to Bay 2. I let him go because I wasn't ready to hear it yet. That afternoon, Dorothy Patterson was waiting at the garden fence when I pulled into the driveway. 67 years old, retired school librarian, widowed 2 years longer than me, and the only neighbor on Wheatfield Drive who'd ever brought me soup without being asked. She was holding her phone the way people hold evidence screen tilted toward her chest thumb, covering the image until she was sure I was close enough to see it. "I don't want to meddle, Vince," she said, using the nickname Peggy had given me that everyone on the block adopted. "But I was at Maggiano's that night, too. I saw you sitting alone, and then I saw this." She turned the phone around. Roxanne's Instagram. A photo posted the night of my birthday, Saturday, September 6th. My daughter stood on a balcony at the Phoenician Resort in Scottsdale, champagne flute, raised Brett beside her in a linen shirt that probably cost more than my sport coat. The sunset behind them was the kind of orange that only exists in Arizona and on postcards. Roxanne was smiling the way she smiled for cameras, which was different from the way she smiled for people. But it wasn't the smile that stopped me. It was the dress. Emerald green off the shoulder, fitted in a way that looked expensive because it was expensive. I knew because I'd paid for it, or rather I'd transferred $3,200 to Roxanne's account the week before for what she called back-to-school clothes for Kieran and some winter things for the kids. The dress wasn't winter things. The dress wasn't for the kids. The dress was on my daughter's back in a resort photo from the night she decided my 60th birthday wasn't worth the drive. $3,200. I said more to myself than to Dorothy. For the grandchildren's clothes. Dorothy didn't say anything. She just reached over the fence and squeezed my wrist, and her hand was warm and papery and steadier than mine. I thanked her and went inside. The house smelled like the coffee I'd left on the warmer too long, burnt and bitter, and I walked past it to Peggy's office. I don't know what I was looking for. Proof, maybe. Or permission. I opened the desk drawer where she'd kept the financial folder and started straightening the papers I'd scattered Saturday night, and that's when I found it. An envelope. Sealed. Peggy's handwriting on the front, shaky the way it got in the last months, addressed to Jerry Ashworth. Our attorney. No stamp, no return address. Just his name in blue ink tucked under the drawer liner like she'd hidden it on purpose, knowing I'd find it eventually, but not too soon. An envelope in my dead wife's handwriting, addressed to my lawyer, tucked where she knew I'd eventually look. Peggy didn't leave anything by accident. I held it for a long time. I didn't open it. It was addressed to Jerry, not to me, and even 4 years after her death, I wasn't going to start reading Peggy's mail. I set it on the desk under the lamp and told myself I'd bring it to Jerry on Friday. Then the doorbell rang, 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, and Garrison Kowalski stood on my front porch. 32 years old owner of a failing bar called the Iron Rail in Berwyn, my middle son who'd inherited Peggy's green eyes and none of her discipline. His shirt was wrinkled untucked on one side, and I could smell the bourbon before I opened the storm door. His eyes were red, but not from crying, from the kind of exhaustion that comes from running out of people to call. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you." "You're drunk, Garrison." "I'm not that drunk." He was. "The Iron Rail loan is due October 15th. I need $22,000. That's it. 22. And then I'm square." My 32-year-old son stood on my porch smelling like bourbon and blaming me for consequences he'd built with his own hands. "You drove here from Berwyn like this?" I asked. "I took an Uber part of the way." "Part of the way isn't all the way, Garrison." He stepped forward and grabbed the porch railing like he needed it. The wood creaked under his grip. Crickets sang in Dorothy's yard next door, and somewhere down the street, a garage door was closing, and my son looked at me with an expression I'd seen on hundreds of customers at the shop. The face of someone who knew the repair bill was bigger than their savings, but hoped I'd cut them a deal anyway. "Mom would never have done this to us," he said. The words hit me in the sternum. He knew they would. He'd chosen them the way you choose a wrench for maximum torque. "Don't bring your mother into this," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, which was worse than shouting, because it meant he'd gotten close to the bone. "She would have helped. She would have told you to stop drinking and sell the bar." Those are her exact words from 2019. I was in the room. Garrison didn't answer that. He looked at the porch floor, at the welcome mat Peggy had bought at a craft fair in Geneva, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "You're drunk," I said again. "I'm calling you an Uber. Go home. Call me when you're sober." I ordered the car on my phone. 7 minutes. We stood on the porch in silence, the kind that fills with everything neither person is willing to say. And when the headlights turned onto Wheatfield Drive, Garrison walked down the steps without another word. The Uber pulled away, and he looked back through the rear window. Under the porch light, for 1 second, he didn't look like a man who needed money. He looked like a boy who needed his father. But the envelope sitting upstairs on Peggy's desk told me that helping him the old way, the checkbook way, the easy way, was exactly what would destroy him. I went inside and locked the door and didn't sleep until 3. I spent Thursday night staring at the ceiling, thinking about Peggy's envelope and Garrison's face in the Uber window, and by Friday morning I'd decided that the only thing worse than knowing the truth was waiting for it to find me. Ray and I ate lunch in the break room at Kowalski Auto, the way we had every Friday for 18 years, sandwiches from the gas station on Route 59, country radio turned low, the smell of brake dust and coffee mixing in the air that came through the vent from the shop floor. Ray was halfway through a turkey club when he set it down on the wax paper and wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "Boss, I need to tell you something I should have said 3 months ago." I put my sandwich down too. When Ray Gutierrez opened a sentence that way, whatever came next was going to rearrange something. 3 months back," he said. "June. You were out at the Kendall County bid. Garrison came to the shop." He paused. "He was in bad shape, boss. Shaking. He said his staff at the bar hadn't been paid in 2 weeks, and he needed $3,500 to cover payroll. He asked me to take it from petty cash." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I couldn't touch petty cash without your signature. That's the truth." Ray looked at the table. But then he started begging, saying people were going to quit, saying he'd lose the kitchen crew. So I went to my truck, got my checkbook, and wrote him a check for $3,500 from my own account. The break room was quiet, except for the radio and the hum of the vending machine. I looked at this man, 45 years old, 2 kids in high school, a mortgage in Cicero, who had paid my son's debt out of his own pocket, rather than let me find out how far things had gone. The man who fixed transmissions beside me for 18 years had been quietly fixing my family's damage with his own paycheck, and never said a word. "Ray," I said, "you're the only person I could trust all that time without knowing it." He shook his head. I should have told you the same day. But there's one more thing. He picked at the edge of his sandwich wrapper. While he was here, Garrison asked me a question that didn't make sense at the time. He asked how many shares you own in the shop, whether it was a sole proprietorship or if there were partners. I told him it's your shop 100%, always has been. He nodded and left. I didn't think much of it then. But with everything that's happening now, I thought you should know. Shares. My 32-year-old son, standing in my shop with bourbon shakes and unpaid staff, had taken the time to ask about my ownership structure. That wasn't a drowning man grabbing a life ring. That was someone taking measurements of the boat. I thanked Ray. I told him I'd pay back the $3,500, and he told me not to insult him. And we finished lunch without saying much else because some conversations fill a room so completely that anything after them sounds like noise. At 4 o'clock, I closed the office door and called Jerry Ashworth. Jerry was 58, my oldest friend since our Army days at Fort Campbell, now an estate attorney with an office on South Wacker Drive in Chicago. He picked up on the second ring like he'd been expecting my call. "I need to come see you about the will," I said. "Monday, if you've got time." "I've got time," Jerry said. Then he paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds, which doesn't sound long until you're on the other end of it, and you know that Jerry Ashworth doesn't pause for anything less than bad news. "Vince, there's something I need to tell you first." "Go ahead." 6 months ago, Brennan came to see me at the office. He didn't make an appointment, just showed up. He asked about voluntary guardianship and power of attorney for an elderly relative living alone. He didn't use your name, but we both know he wasn't asking about a stranger. Peggy's death anniversary. Of all the days to walk into a lawyer's office and ask how to take control of your father, he chose that one. March 2024, 3 years to the week since we buried her, and my eldest son spent that afternoon researching how to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs. "Why didn't you tell me then, I asked, and my voice was steady, which surprised me because my hands were not. "Because he didn't file anything," Jerry said. "No petition, no action. He was fishing. I told him I couldn't represent him in any matter involving you conflict of interest. He left. I've been watching the court docket since and nothing's been filed. But Vince, you need to understand what this means. He wasn't just asking questions. He was building a case." "For what?" "For control. Guardianship gives him authority over your finances, your medical decisions, your property. If he could demonstrate diminished capacity isolation, erratic behavior, financial mismanagement, a judge could grant it." "Financial mismanagement," I repeated, "like closing a bank account my children were draining." "Exactly like that." I sat in the chair behind my desk and pressed my palm flat against the surface. Through the office glass, I could see the shop floor, the lifts, the rolling tool carts, the air compressor I'd bought in 1997, the alignment rack I'd installed myself over a weekend in 2004. 31 years of building something from nothing. Every bolt I'd tightened, every estimate I'd written, every Saturday I'd spent here instead of at home because I thought providing was the same thing as being present. Garrison had asked Ray about my shares. Brennan had asked Jerry about guardianship. It wasn't just the checking account they were circling. They wanted the shop. They wanted the house. They wanted all of it. I hung up and sat in the quiet office listening to the pneumatic wrench cycle in Bay 3. And for the first time since Saturday, I didn't feel angry. I felt something colder than anger. I felt ready. I spent Friday night at the kitchen table with a cup of decaf going cold beside me, thinking about shares and guardianship, and the distance between what my sons asked strangers and what they never bothered to ask me. By Saturday morning, I knew what I was going to do. I just didn't know if it would work. Brennan didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed through the front door at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, like he still owned a room in this house. Brennan Kowalski, my 37-year-old eldest regional sales director at Harrington Logistics in Chicago, wearing a navy suit with no tie and shoes that clicked on the hardwood like he was walking into a conference room instead of his father's kitchen. He was tall, like Peggy, sharp-jawed like me, and he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they've spent their whole career convincing people they belong in rooms they weren't invited to. "Dad," he said, "we need to have a serious conversation." "Coffee?" I asked. "I don't want coffee. I want to talk about what you've done." He pulled out a chair and sat down hard enough to make the legs scrape the floor. "Do you have any idea what happened this week? The Harrington deal, $2.3 million in managed logistics. I had the managing partner at the table and Brett's card got declined in front of him, in front of his wife. Do you understand what that costs me?" "I understand what it costs you," I said. "I'm less clear on what it cost me." "What does that mean?" I opened the kitchen drawer beside the stove. Inside, next to the rubber bands and the spare batteries, I'd placed a blank sheet of white paper and a ballpoint pen. I took both out, set them on the table between us, and slid them across to Brennan. He looked at the paper. He looked at me. "Write down the last date you called me just to ask how I was doing," I said. "No money, no favor, no business, just to check in. Month and year's fine." Brennan picked up the pen. He held it over the paper the way you hold a tool when you're not sure what it's for. 5 seconds. 10. The pen didn't move. The refrigerator hummed behind me and sunlight came through the window over the sink and landed on the table between us, illuminating the blank page like a document waiting for a signature that wasn't coming. A blank sheet of paper. That's all it took to prove my eldest son couldn't remember a single time he'd reached out to me for free. "This isn't fair," Brennan said. It was the second time he'd said that to me in a week. "You're right. It's not fair, but the paper's still empty." He put the pen down. Not a slam, not a toss. He placed it carefully beside the paper, like a man conceding a point in a negotiation he hadn't expected to lose. The kitchen smelled like the coffee I'd made an hour ago, and the faint trace of lemon cleaner on the countertops, and through the window I could hear a lawnmower starting up 2 houses over. Normal Saturday sounds. Nothing about this Saturday was normal. "I've been busy," Brennan said quietly. "You've been busy for 3 years, Brennan. Since before your mother died, you've been busy. Every call is about money or the business or something you need signed. Every visit comes with an ask attached. I stopped counting because counting made it worse." He leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms, but the posture wasn't aggressive anymore. It was protective. He looked less like the sales director who closed million-dollar deals and more like the confused 12-year-old who used to sit at this same table doing homework while Peggy made dinner 3 feet away. "What do you want from us, Dad?" he asked. And for the first time that morning, his voice didn't have an edge. It had a crack. "I want my son," I said. "Not the person sitting here. Not the man who walks in without knocking and talks about deals and cards and what things cost. I want the boy who used to help me change the oil on the truck on Saturday mornings because he liked the way the wrench felt in his hand. I want the kid who called me from college his first week just to tell me the dining hall had bad meatloaf. I want my son Brennan, the real one. I haven't seen him in years." The lawnmower outside cut off, and the silence that followed was the kind that pushes against your chest. Brennan looked at the table, at the blank paper, at his own hands which were clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "I don't know who that is anymore," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me since Peggy's funeral, and it landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. I didn't respond, because there was nothing to say to a man who'd just admitted he'd lost himself, and any words I offered would have sounded like a lecture when what he needed was time. He stood up. He pushed the chair in carefully without scraping it this time. He walked to the front door and stopped with his hand on the knob. I thought he might turn around. He didn't. "I'll call you," he said. I know, I said. I didn't ask when. Brennan closed the front door quietly. No slam, which was somehow worse because a slam means anger, and anger means you still care enough to make noise. A quiet close means something I wasn't ready to name. I sat alone at the kitchen table and looked at the blank sheet of paper. Then I picked it up, folded it once, and carried it down the hall to Peggy's office. I opened the desk drawer and placed it beside the sealed envelope addressed to Jerry Ashworth. 2 pieces of paper in a dead woman's desk. One empty one still unread. Both telling me the same story about a family that had forgotten how to love each other without a price tag attached. I left the 2 pieces of paper in Peggy's desk and closed the drawer. I didn't know what to do with either of them yet, but I knew they'd wait for me the way Peggy always waited patiently, without complaint, until I was ready to listen. Roxanne called 3 hours after Brennan left, and I could tell from her first breath that she'd rehearsed every word. My 35-year-old daughter had built 180,000 Instagram followers on a lifestyle funded largely by my credit line, and she spoke the way people speak when they're performing for an audience, even when the only person listening is their father. "Dad," she said, and her voice carried the precise tremor of someone who'd practiced vulnerability in front of a mirror. "Alara just asked me why Grandpa's card can't buy toys anymore. Do you understand what you're doing? You're punishing the children." Alara, my 8-year-old granddaughter who drew pictures of stick figure families and mailed them to me in envelopes she decorated with stickers. Roxanne had put her name in the first sentence like a shield held up in front of a castle. "Roxanne," I said. I was standing in the backyard near Peggy's tomato plants, the late afternoon sun warm on my arms. "Last week you asked me for $2,800 for groceries. That same week you posted a dinner at Nobu in Chicago. I'm looking at the photo right now." Dorothy showed it to me. Silence. 3 seconds. "That was a sponsored dinner, Dad. I do partnerships. You don't understand how my world works. There's no brand tag on the photo," I said. "No discount code. No sponsor mention. Just a $280 omakase and a cocktail with your husband's hand on the table. I may not understand your world, Roxanne, but I can read a dinner check." Talking to Roxanne was like arguing with a billboard. Every response was designed to sell something, and none of it was the truth. "You don't get to audit my life," she said, and the rehearsed tremor was gone now, replaced by something harder and more honest. "I'm your daughter. You're my daughter who asked me for grocery money and spent it on a $200 dinner the next night. Those 2 things can both be true, Roxanne. I just can't pay for them both anymore. You'll regret this, Dad. Maybe, but I'll regret it with a bank account that isn't bleeding." She hung up. No goodbye. The apple didn't fall far. Brennan had done the same thing that morning. I stood in the garden listening to the dial tone, and then the silence after it, and I thought about Alara drawing stick figures at a kitchen table in Scottsdale, and I wondered how long it would be before Roxanne taught her that love was a currency too. Sunday came and went. I went to the shop in the morning, came home in the afternoon, heated up leftover chicken marsala from the Maggiano's boxes that were still in the fridge. The food tasted like a memory I wanted to throw away, but couldn't yet. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Lori Kowalski stood on the porch. My youngest at 29, an HR coordinator in Oak Brook, who rarely visited and never came alone. She was wearing jeans and a sweater that was too big for her, and her hair was pulled back in the kind of ponytail that meant she'd left in a hurry. Behind her, parked at the curb, a gray Honda sat running with someone in the driver's seat, her boyfriend Holden, I assumed, though I'd only met him once. "Dad," she said, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about the party." She was the first of my 4 children to apologize, and for 30 seconds I let myself believe it was the beginning of something honest. "Come in," I said. She sat on the edge of the couch like someone visiting a house she wasn't sure she was welcome in. I made her tea chamomile, the kind Peggy used to keep in the cabinet above the stove. Lori wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the living room the way you look at a place you haven't seen in a long time, noticing what's changed and what hasn't. I should have come to Maggiano's, she said. I knew about it. I just didn't. I don't have a good reason. You don't need a reason, Lori. You just needed to show up. She nodded. We talked for 20 minutes, careful talk, the kind where both people are circling something they haven't named yet. She asked about the shop. She asked about my knee. She said she'd been thinking about Peggy lately, which was the first time any of my children had mentioned their mother's name to me in months. You know why you came alone today, I said. Because you were afraid your siblings would stop you. Lori didn't deny it. She set the mug on the coffee table and looked at her hands. They're not bad people, Dad. I didn't say they were. I said you were afraid of them. She stood up and carried the mug to the kitchen sink, rinsed it the way Peggy had taught all of them to rinse things, and walked toward the front door. She had her hand on the knob when I said it. Lori, do you know about your siblings' group chat? She stopped. Her back was to me and she didn't turn around. Her shoulders pulled in tight, the same way Peggy's used to when she was holding back something she knew would hurt if she let it out. The hallway clock ticked. The Honda's engine hummed faintly through the closed door. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence told me everything that my youngest, my quietest, the one I'd thought might be different, had been reading every message in a conversation I wasn't supposed to know about. Lori opened the door and walked out without looking back. The Honda pulled away from the curb. I stood in the hallway holding a question she couldn't answer, and a silence that answered it for her. Lori's silence followed me through the rest of Sunday like a smell I couldn't wash off. By Monday morning, I'd accepted what it meant all four of them knew things I didn't, and the youngest had chosen the group over the father. Garrison knocked Monday evening. Actually knocked knuckles on wood, 2 measured raps, which told me he was sober enough to remember he didn't own this house. I opened the door and found a different version of my middle son than the one who'd stood here 4 days ago. Same wrinkled clothes, but clean this time. Eyes tired instead of glazed. Hands steady at his sides. I'm sorry about Thursday, Dad, he said. I shouldn't have said what I said about Mom. I looked at him standing on the porch in the early evening light, and something in my chest loosened half a turn. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition that this boy had driven here sober to apologize, and that cost him something. Sit down, I said. I'll make coffee. We sat in the living room with mugs on the coffee table and talked about things that didn't hurt. The shop I told him about the Kendall County Fleet bid I'd won. The garden Peggy's tomatoes were still producing, and I didn't know what to do with all of them. A Cubs game from last week that neither of us had watched, but both of us pretended to remember. Garrison told me the kitchen at the bar was doing better than the bar side, that his head cook had created a smoked brisket sandwich that people were driving from Oak Park to try. The bar's in trouble, Dad, he said, and his voice was quiet in a way that wasn't performing. Real trouble. But I'm not here to ask for money tonight. I just needed to sit somewhere that didn't smell like a kitchen that's failing. For 20 minutes, my son and I talked like human beings. No invoices, no emergencies, no lies. And I almost forgot why I'd been sleeping with my phone turned off. Around 7:45, Garrison excused himself to use the bathroom. He left his phone on the coffee table the way young people do, face up, screen dark, resting on the wood next to his coffee mug. I wasn't looking at it. I was looking at the window, at the last orange light fading over Dorothy's roofline, thinking about how a simple conversation with your own child shouldn't feel like a rare event. Then the phone vibrated. Once. Twice. 3 times in quick succession, the screen lighting up with each buzz, and the group chat notification glowed on the lock screen in letters bright enough to read from where I sat. The chat name was 2 words, No Dad Zone. The preview message was from Roxanne. Is Garrison there? Don't reveal anything. 3 words on a lock screen. No Dad Zone. They'd named it. They'd actually given a name to the place where they coordinated how to manage me, how to extract from me, how to keep me outside the circle of my own family. This wasn't four children making individual bad choices. This was organized. It had a title. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't pick it up, didn't scroll, didn't screenshot. I sat in my chair and looked at those two words until the screen went dark again, and then I listened to the bathroom faucet running down the hall and waited for my son to come back. Garrison returned and picked up his phone without checking. It slid it into his back pocket and sat down like nothing had changed. And maybe for him, nothing had. He didn't know I'd seen it. He finished his coffee and told me he was going to look into selling the bar's liquor license separately from the lease, and I nodded and said that sounded smart, and my voice came out normal because I'd spent 60 years learning how to keep my face still when the ground was moving. He left around 8:15, gave me a handshake at the door that turned into a half-hug, brief, awkward, the kind of contact men offer when they want to do more but don't know how. I watched his taillights disappear down Wheatfield Drive, and then I closed the door and locked it. The house was quiet. I sat back down in the living room and opened the ruled notepad that had been sitting on the side table since Wednesday. I turned past the voicemail columns, angry, panicked, calculating tears, silent, and on a fresh page I wrote 2 words in block letters: "No Dad Zone." I stared at them. The handwriting was mine, but the words were theirs, and seeing them in my own letters, on my own paper, in my own house made them real in a way the glowing screen hadn't. My 4 children, the ones I'd built this house for, funded college for co-signed loans, for stayed awake worrying about, for 3 decades, had created a private space specifically designed to exclude me. And they'd named it like a clubhouse. Like a joke. I set the notepad down and looked across the room at Peggy's photo on the bookshelf. The anniversary frame, her laughing at something I'd said, the lake behind her catching the last of the sun. "Are they afraid of me?" I said to her, "or ashamed of themselves?" She didn't answer. She never did. But the question hung in the living room like cigarette smoke, thick and hard to breathe through. I picked up my phone and called Jerry Ashworth. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear a baseball game on in the background, the low murmur of a crowd, and an announcer calling a pitch. "Jerry, I need to come see you tomorrow," I said. "Not about the will, about a legal matter. Something my son started 6 months ago that I just found out about." Jerry muted the television. The silence on the line told me he knew exactly which son I meant. "I'll clear my morning," he said. "Be here at 10. Jerry cleared his morning the way he said he would. I drove into the city Tuesday with Peggy's envelope on the passenger seat and the notepad in my jacket pocket, 2 words written in block letters on the last page like a password to a door I hadn't opened yet. Jerry Ashworth's office on the 17th floor of 200 South Wacker looked out over the Chicago River, and I'd sat in that leather chair 100 times over 30 years for the will for the shop's LLC filing for Peggy's estate, but never once feeling like my own son was the opposing counsel. Jerry closed the door and sat across from me with the manila folder on his desk. He was wearing the reading glasses Peggy had helped him pick out at Costco the year before she died, and seeing them on his face made the room feel smaller. "Tell me everything," I said. He opened the folder. March 14th of this year. Brennan walked in without an appointment. My assistant tried to schedule him for the following week, but he said it couldn't wait. Jerry looked at me over the glasses. He sat where you're sitting now. He asked me what it would take to declare an elderly parent unable to manage his own affairs. He used the words voluntary guardianship and durable power of attorney. He said the parent was living alone, making erratic financial decisions and showing signs of cognitive decline. March 14th, I said. That was the anniversary of Peggy's death. "I know," Jerry said. "That's why I remember every word. My son visited a lawyer to take control of my life, and he chose the day his mother died to do it." I sat with that for a long time. The river moved below the window, gray-green and slow barges pushing south toward the lock. The office smelled like leather and the faint sweetness of the mints Jerry kept in a bowl on the credenza. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I couldn't represent him in any matter involving you. Conflict of interest. I've been your attorney for over a decade." He nodded like he expected that answer. Then he asked if I could recommend someone who could. I told him no. Jerry closed the folder. He left. "No petition has been filed. I've been checking the docket monthly since March. But Vince, what he described, isolation, erratic finances, a parent living alone without oversight. If he finds a judge sympathetic to that narrative, the bar for emergency guardianship in Illinois is lower than most people think." "Closing my own bank account," I said. "That's what he'd call erratic. That's exactly what he'd call it." We spent the next hour working. Jerry would begin drafting a new will, removing Brennan as executor, restructuring the distribution, and creating a separate, irrevocable trust for Alara that none of the adults could touch. I told him about the group chat, about the pattern of fabricated emergencies, about the total I'd counted on the legal pad. Jerry wrote it all down in the same precise handwriting he'd had since we were both 20-year-olds at Fort Campbell, learning how to clean rifles faster than the man next to us. Before I left, I set the envelope on his desk. "This was in Peggy's drawer," I said. "Addressed to you. I haven't opened it because it's not mine to open." Jerry picked it up and turned it over. He recognized the handwriting immediately. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened. "Did you know about this?" I asked. "No," he said. "But I'm not surprised. Peggy was the most prepared person I ever met. She probably wrote one for me, one for you, and one for God, just to cover all the angles." He opened it carefully, the way you open something from someone who's gone. 3 pages. Lined paper from the spiral notebook she kept on her nightstand in the hospital. The handwriting was shaky. The medication did that to her hands in the last weeks, but the words, even from across the desk, looked deliberate. Jerry read the first page in silence. Then he looked up. "She wants you to read this, Vince." The first line says, "Jerry, if Vince still doesn't change after I'm gone, please let him read this letter. He needs to hear this from me, not from anyone else." He handed me the pages. I held them the way you hold something fragile, not because the paper was thin, but because the woman who wrote it had been dying when she pressed the pen down, and every stroke carried the weight of someone running out of time. Her handwriting shook from the medication that was supposed to buy her more time, but the words were steadier than anything I'd heard from my children in years. I read the first paragraph. She wrote about the money, how she'd watched the pattern forming, years before I noticed how she'd tried to warn me, and I'd called her dramatic. She wrote about each child by name with the precision of a mother who loved them completely and saw them clearly, which is not the same thing. I stopped after the first page. I couldn't do the rest. Not in Jerry's office, not with the river outside and the traffic noise 17 floors below, and the fluorescent lights turning everything the wrong shade of white. This needed to be read at home at her desk under her lamp. "How long did you carry this alone, Peggy?" I said to no one. Jerry didn't answer. He just handed me a tissue from the box on his credenza and looked out the window to give me the room. I drove home with the letter in the envelope and the envelope against my chest. At Peggy's desk that evening, I placed the 3 pages against her photo, the lamp casting her handwriting in warm gold. She'd known. 3 weeks before the cancer took her, she'd sat at this same desk and written to the one man she trusted to protect me from myself. Whatever the rest of those pages held, she'd prepared for this exact moment. I wasn't ready to hear it yet, but I would be. I woke Tuesday morning having dreamed about Peggy's handwriting, the shaky letters floating off the page like birds leaving a wire. The rest of her letter sat on the desk where I'd left it waiting. But before I could decide if today was the day I'd finish reading it, Dorothy was at the fence again. This time she wasn't holding a screenshot. She was holding a video. Vince, I debated whether to show you this, she said, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and her cardigan pulled tight across her arms even though the morning was warm. But you need to see what she's doing. She pressed play. Roxanne's face filled the screen, soft lighting, a cream-colored wall behind her, her hair pulled back in the kind of effortless style that takes 30 minutes to achieve. An Instagram reel, 8 minutes long. The title read, "When the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the one you need protection from." She spoke directly to the camera, voice low and controlled with a quiver that surfaced at precise intervals every 90 seconds like a metronome. She never used my name. She said my father. She said a man who chose money over his own grandchildren. She said I spent my whole life trying to earn his approval, and the moment I needed him most, he turned off his phone and locked us out. I watched all 8 minutes standing at the fence with Dorothy's phone in my hand. The comments scrolled underneath in real time. Hearts, crying faces, strangers writing paragraphs about their own fathers. 180,000 followers absorbing a version of my life that had been edited, lit, and scored like a short film. 180,000 strangers were deciding I was a monster, based on an 8-minute performance from a woman who'd charged her wardrobe to my credit line. She's not crying, I said to Dorothy, handing the phone back. She's performing. Dorothy took the phone and held it against her chest, the way she always did when she was carrying something she wished she could put down. What are you going to do? Nothing, I said. You don't win a fight with a billboard by standing in the road. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and didn't look at my phone for the rest of the morning. I made eggs. I washed the pan. I wiped down the counter. Small tasks that required hands and no thinking because the thinking would have sent me to places I wasn't ready to go. That evening around 7, the phone buzzed with a video call. The screen showed a face I hadn't seen in weeks, Kieran Prescott, 22 years old, Roxanne's son, putting himself through an engineering degree at UIUC on scholarships and weekend shifts at a grocery store in Champaign. He appeared on my screen from a dorm room with cinder block walls and a desk lamp that made his face half bright, half shadow. He looked like his mother around the eyes, but carried himself like someone who'd decided early that looking like a person and being like a person were different things. "Grandpa," he said, "I saw Mom's video. So did everybody else, apparently. It's not true. You know it's not true, and I can prove it." I sat down. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and the faint sound of a neighbor's sprinkler through the open window. Kieran's face on the screen was steady, but his jaw was tight the way young men look when they're holding something heavy and trying not to show the weight. "Grandpa, I need to tell you something. I should have told you a long time ago." He paused. "Last year, summer of 2023, I was staying at Mom's house in Scottsdale for a week. I came downstairs to get water and Mom was on the phone with a friend in the living room. She didn't know I was there." Another pause. She was laughing. She said Dad feels so guilty about Mom dying that he can't say no to anything. Just mention the grandkids and he transfers whatever you ask. He hasn't figured it out yet. The kitchen went very still. The sprinkler outside kept running. The refrigerator kept humming. The world kept turning at the same speed it always had, but something inside my chest locked into a position it would never leave. My 22-year-old grandson had carried the weight of his mother's cruelty for over a year because he didn't know which adult in this family he could trust. And that might be the saddest thing I'd heard in all of this. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Since that night." July 2023. I took screenshots of everything after that, texts between Mom and Uncle Brennan, group chat messages, everything. 23 screenshots. His voice cracked on the number. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, Grandpa. I didn't know how. I kept thinking maybe I misheard her, or maybe she was joking, but she wasn't joking. She does it every time. Mentions Alara, mentions the kids, and the money comes. Kieran, I said, and I kept my voice as level as I could, because this boy needed steadiness more than he needed my anger. You didn't do anything wrong. You were 21 years old, and your mother put you in an impossible position. That's not your fault. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The dorm room behind him was small and bare, a twin bed, a textbook open on the desk, a poster of a bridge I didn't recognize taped to the cinder block. This was a kid who worked weekends to pay for what the scholarship didn't cover, living in a room the size of my bathroom, carrying evidence of his own mother's manipulation like a stone in his pocket. I'll be back Friday, Grandpa, he said. I want to help. After the call ended, I sat in the kitchen holding the phone. The screen went dark, and I could see my own reflection in it. An old man in a quiet house who'd just learned that his daughter had weaponized his grief over his dead wife to extract money she spent on dinners and dresses and resort vacations. My daughter had turned 180,000 strangers against me. My grandson had spent a year building the evidence to prove her wrong. I set the phone down and looked at the hallway that led to Peggy's office. The letter was still in there. 3 pages, 2.5 unread. Tonight I decided. Tonight I'd finish it. I didn't finish the letter Tuesday night. I sat with it on the desk until midnight, then put it back against Peggy's photo and went to bed. But sleep didn't come. At 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending, walked to the kitchen, and sat down under the lamp with cold coffee and all 3 pages spread flat on the table. I started from the beginning again. The first page I'd already read at Jerry's office, the overview, the warning about the money, the way she'd laid out the pattern she saw forming. But the second and third pages were new territory, and Peggy had written them the way she did everything with love so clear it cut. She wrote about Brennan first. He is the most like you, Vince, which is why you can't see what he's becoming. He learned ambition from watching you build the shop, but he never learned the part where you stop and come home. He will try to control what he cannot earn. Don't let him. Let him fail. It's the only teacher he'll respect. She wrote about Roxanne next, and the words were harder. Roxanne performs love the way she performs everything for an audience. She learned early that tears get results, and she never stopped using them. When the audience disappears, she'll have to decide if any of it was real. Don't be her audience anymore, Vince. She needs a mirror, not a stage. About Garrison, she was gentler, but no less precise. Garrison will drown in something unless someone stops rescuing him. I don't know if it will be the bar or the drinking, or both, but he uses your money the way some men use a painkiller to avoid feeling what's actually wrong. You cannot rescue him into health. Let him learn responsibility. It will hurt you more than it hurts him, and that's how you'll know it's working. She wrote this while the medication was eating her from the inside out, and her handwriting still made more sense than anything my 4 living children had said to me in a week. About Lori, she wrote the least, but it stayed with me the longest. Lori is the quiet one, and quiet children get overlooked in loud families. She will stay silent until silence becomes complicity. She's not cruel, Vince. She's afraid. She needs courage, and she won't find it in the group. She'll find it alone, or she won't find it at all. I set the second page down and picked up the third. The handwriting was worse here, the letters slanting more, the pen pressure lighter, as though her hand was tiring or the medication had kicked in harder. But the words were the clearest of all. I know you'll read this after I'm gone because Jerry will hold it until the right moment, and Jerry always knows the right moment. I know you'll be sitting somewhere in our house, probably at the kitchen table, because that's where you think best, and I know you'll be angry and hurt and wondering where you went wrong. She was right about the table. She was right about the anger. She'd been right about everything. You went wrong in the same place every good father goes wrong. You confused providing with protecting. You gave them money when they needed consequences. You gave them comfort when they needed truth. You did it because you love them, and I love you for that. But love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. And you don't surrender Vincent Kowalski. You never have. Peggy had been dead for 3 years, and she was still the only person in this family who told me the truth without wanting something in return. The last paragraph was short. 5 lines. The handwriting steadied as though she'd gripped the pen tighter for the ending, determined to finish strong. Stop saving them. Stop catching them before they fall. Stop writing checks that postpone the lessons they need to learn. You are not their bank. You are not their safety net. You are their father, and a father's job is not to prevent pain. It's to be there when pain teaches them something they couldn't learn any other way. I love you, Vincent. Now let them be strong. I put the pages down on the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood. The house was silent in the way houses are at 3 in the morning. No traffic outside, no refrigerator cycle, no wind against the windows. Just the settling sounds of a structure built in 1987 and the heartbeat in my own ears. I cried. Not the way I'd cried at her funeral, which was public and controlled and involved a handkerchief and a straight back in the front pew. This was the other kind, the kind that comes at 3 in the morning when nobody is watching, and you finally let the thing you've been carrying hit the floor. My shoulders shook, and my hands pressed harder against the table, and I made sounds I hadn't made since the night she died alone in this same kitchen, with the phone still warm from the hospital's call. She'd known. 3 weeks before the cancer finished. What it started, Peggy had sat at her desk, maybe in the middle of the night, like me, maybe with her own cold coffee, and written a letter to protect me from the one thing she couldn't fight from a hospital bed, my own generosity. She'd profiled each child with a mother's love and an analyst's precision. She'd predicted the pattern. She'd given me permission to do what I would never have done on my own. And she'd said, I love you at the end, because Peggy never left a room or a letter or a life without making sure the last thing you heard was the truth. Dawn came slow through the kitchen window, painting the garden in pale September gold. Her tomato plants stood in rows along the back fence, still growing, still producing, still alive because someone tended them every day without expecting anything back. I folded the 3 pages carefully and placed them in my shirt pocket close to my chest. Friday, Kieran was coming with his screenshots, and now I had Peggy's words to guide what I did with them. Peggy's letter stayed in my shirt pocket all week, like a compass I kept touching to make sure it was still there. Wednesday through Thursday, I went to the shop, ate alone, slept in pieces. Friday afternoon, I heard the muffler. Before I saw the car, a rattling exhaust note that told me Kieran's Honda needed work he probably couldn't afford. And by the time I reached the front door, he was already coming up the walk with a backpack over one shoulder and the look of a young man carrying something heavier than textbooks. I didn't take him inside right away. We sat on the back porch instead, the two of us in the aluminum chairs Peggy had bought at a Labor Day sale years ago, looking at the garden. The tomatoes were past their peak, now splitting on the vine, and the air smelled like overripe fruit and cut grass from Dorothy's side of the fence. I need to say something before I show you anything, Kieran said. He was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, turning a water bottle in his hands. Mom wasn't always like this, Grandpa. When I was little, 7, 8, she used to bake with me on Saturdays. Real baking, not for Instagram. She'd let me crack the eggs, and she never got mad when I dropped the shells in. That was before the followers. Before Brett. Before everything became about how things looked. I listened. The porch creaked under my chair when I shifted. She learned that everything is possible if you know how to ask the right person, he continued. And she got good at asking, really good. But somebody taught her that the asking always works. Who taught her that? I said, though something in my stomach already knew. Kieran looked at me. Steady. Not cruel, not angry. just honest in a way that only comes from people who've spent a long time choosing their words. You did, Grandpa. By never saying no, my grandson was right. And it hit me harder than anything Brennan or Roxanne had said all week, because the person who'd created the pattern of dependency wasn't any of my children. It was me. Every check I wrote taught them the check would always come. Every emergency I funded taught them that emergencies were the fastest path to my wallet. I'd spent 30 years being the man who fixes things, and somewhere along the way, my children stopped learning how to fix things for themselves. Peggy told me the same thing, I said, in a letter she wrote before she died. Kieran nodded slowly. Grandma was smart, smarter than all of us. We sat there for another minute without talking. A cardinal landed on the fence post near the tomatoes and stayed for 3 seconds before deciding we weren't interesting enough to watch. Then Kieran stood up and said, "Okay, let me show you." We went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop, and for the next 40 minutes, I watched my family's private machinery laid out in screenshots the way a mechanic lays out parts on a shop rag, each one telling you exactly what's broken and how it broke. 23 screenshots. iMessage conversations spanning late 2023 through August 2024. Kieran had organized them chronologically, and I read them in order one by one while he sat across from me in silence. The first set was Roxanne texting a friend named Jessica. Roxanne explained the technique like a tutorial mention. Alara first, then mention a specific dollar amount, then add a time pressure. He can't say no if the grandkids are involved, she wrote. He literally cannot do it. It's like a button. The second set was Roxanne to Brennan direct messages. One from March read, "Use Alara as an excuse. Ask for 3,000 this time. Don't go higher than that, or he'll start asking questions." Brennan's reply, already on it, told him the transmission blew. The third set was from the group chat. I recognized the name at the top of the screen, No Dad Zone, and seeing it in text form was different from seeing it flash on Garrison's lock screen. In text form, it looked permanent. It looked like policy. One message from Roxanne, dated August 2024, read, "Dad's good for another 5,000 if we time it right after his birthday. He always gets sentimental around September. Time it right after his birthday." They'd scheduled my exploitation like a quarterly sales target. I read every screenshot. I didn't skip any. Some were worse than others. There was one where Brennan discussed the guardianship idea in the chat, floating it as a backup plan in case I started making trouble. Garrison's replies were shorter, less strategic, mostly asking when the next transfer would come. Lori appeared in only 3 threads, never initiating, but never objecting either. Silent. Complicit. Exactly the way Peggy had predicted. When I finished, I closed the laptop screen gently. The way you close a book you'll need to open again. "Keep these," I said. "Don't delete them. Don't let anyone know you have them." Kieran nodded. "What are you going to do with them, Grandpa?" I thought about Peggy's letter against my chest. About the will on Jerry's desk waiting for my signature. About the reel still circulating with its soft lighting and its practiced tears and its 180,000 hearts from strangers who thought they knew my daughter. I thought about the group chat named after my absence, about messages timed to my grief, about a family that had turned fatherhood into a revenue stream. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm glad they exist." Kieran stayed for dinner. I made spaghetti with sauce from a jar, because that's all I had, and we ate at the table where the screenshots had been, and we talked about his engineering classes and a bridge design project he was working on, and whether the Cubs had any chance in October. Normal things. Good things. The kitchen smelled like garlic and boiling water, and for an hour it almost felt like a house where a family lived, instead of a house where a family fell apart. He left around 9. At the door he hugged me, not the half-hug Garrison had offered, but a real one. Both arms, the kind that lasts long enough to mean something. I'll come back whenever you need me, he said. I know you will, I said, and I meant it. I spent Friday night thinking about what to do with 23 screenshots and a dead woman's letter, and by Saturday morning I'd decided the next step wasn't digital, it was physical. I needed to see the iron rail with my own eyes. Ray drove. I sat in the passenger seat of his truck, watching the city change from suburb to expressway to the low brick buildings of Wicker Park, and neither of us said much because Ray had the sense to know when quiet was more useful than conversation. He parked on a side street half a block from the bar, and when I got out, I could already see the sign hand-painted faded the R in rail peeling at the corner. I'd never been to my son's bar. Not once in 3 years. Garrison had invited me early on, but I'd been busy at the shop, and then Peggy got sick, and then Peggy died, and then the invitations stopped coming. Standing on that sidewalk, I understood why he'd stopped asking. The iron rail, at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, had 3 customers. 2 of them sat at the far end of the bar, watching college football on a television, mounted too high on the wall. The third was eating alone at a table near the window. The jukebox in the corner played country music to a room that wasn't listening. The floors were sticky. The air smelled like spilled beer and fryer grease that had been used too many times. The iron rail smelled like spilled beer and lost ambition, a bar that had stopped trying to attract customers and was just waiting for someone to turn the lights off. Garrison came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, and froze when he saw me. He looked from me to Ray and back to me, and something crossed his face that wasn't anger or shame, it was surprise that I'd come at all. "Dad," he said, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see your place." We sat at the bar. He poured me a ginger ale, without asking whether I wanted anything stronger, which told me he remembered more about me than I gave him credit for. We talked. Not about the loan or the deadline or the money. About when he was 14 and told Peggy he wanted to be a chef. About the summer he worked at a diner in Berwyn and came home smelling like pancake batter every night. About when things started to go sideways, the lease he couldn't afford, the liquor license he overpaid for the partners who bailed after 6 months. "I don't know what I'll do if I lose this bar," he said. "Let me ask you something," I said. "Will this restaurant save you, or will Dad save you? Is there a difference?" He didn't answer. He wiped the bar with his towel in slow circles, and the television played a game neither of us was watching. On the drive back, Ray waited until we were on the expressway before he said it. "Boss, why didn't you give him money?" I watched the skyline shrink in the side mirror. "Because if I save that restaurant, I save the restaurant, not Garrison." Ray nodded and changed lanes, and we didn't speak again until Naperville. Before I tell you what Lori said to me the next morning, the confession that changed how I saw my youngest daughter, I need to ask you something. Do you think Lori was guilty or just afraid? Comment your answer with one reason why. And please note some details going forward are adapted for storytelling. The lesson behind them is what I hope stays with you. Sunday morning I met Lori at a restaurant in Oak Brook. Neutral ground. She'd picked the place a brunch spot with white tablecloths and a noise level that made private conversation possible without whispering. She was already seated when I arrived, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, the way she'd done at my house 2 weeks earlier. We ordered. She got an omelet she didn't eat. I got toast I didn't taste. The small talk lasted 4 minutes before she set her fork down and looked at me with eyes that had Peggy's color and none of Peggy's steadiness. "I didn't participate in the planning, Dad," she said, "but I didn't stop them either. I read every message, I never said a word." She paused. "And I took money. $12,400. Not because I needed it. Because it was too easy. Because nobody ever said no, so it didn't feel like stealing. $12,400. Not a fortune. But enough to prove that even my quietest child had learned the same lesson as the others, that my wallet had no lock on the door. "Will you forgive me?" she asked. I looked at her across the table. This was the girl who'd left my house 2 weeks ago, unable to answer a question, about the group chat. Now she was sitting across from me, naming dollar amounts and admitting what she'd done without anyone forcing her hand. Peggy's letter echoed in my chest. She needs courage. I don't know, I said. But I respect you because you asked honestly. That's the difference between you and your siblings right now, Lori. You told me yourself. That's more than I deserve, she said quietly. Maybe, but it's what I've got. Lori left the restaurant, and I sat with my cold coffee thinking about Peggy's words and the way each child was landing exactly where she'd predicted Brennan controlling Roxanne performing Garrison drowning. Lori finding courage one painful sentence at a time. I paid the check and walked to the parking lot. Halfway to the truck, my phone buzzed with a text from Jerry. 6 words that turned the morning's fragile peace into something urgent. Brennan hired outside counsel. He's filing to contest the will. We need to move fast, Vince. I sat in the driver's seat and read it twice. My eldest son wasn't just fighting me for money anymore. He was fighting me in court. Jerry's text sat on my phone screen all Sunday night, like a warrant I couldn't put down. By Monday morning, I was at the shop before the lights were on, waiting for the call I knew was coming. My eldest son had done a lot of things I never expected, but hiring a lawyer to prove I was too old to make my own decisions, that was a line I didn't think even Brennan would cross. Jerry called at 9:15. I took it in the back office with the door shut and the shop radio turned off. He's retained outside counsel, Jerry said. A man named Hargrove out of Schaumburg, estate litigation specialist. Not cheap billable rate suggests someone's funding this probably Christine's family money. Jerry paused to let that land. The argument is undue influence. He's claiming Kieran manipulated you into changing the will to exclude your own children. Kieran, I said, my 22-year-old grandson who pays his own tuition with a grocery store job. That's the mastermind. Logic doesn't matter in a filing, Vince. What matters is that if Brennan petitions before we finalize the new will, a judge could freeze everything, the estate, the trust, even amendments in progress. Months of limbo. We need to sign Wednesday. I've already got 2 witnesses lined up from my office. My son hired a lawyer named Hargrove to argue that I'm too feeble to know my own mind. The same mind that built a business from a 2-bay garage, that raised 4 children to adulthood, that kept a family running for 30 years after every transmission blew and every roof leaked and every tuition bill landed on the same desk where I was sitting right now. What about the screenshots? I asked. Kieran's evidence. Not yet, Jerry said. We hold those. If Brennan files, the screenshots become our counter. 23 messages proving coordinated financial exploitation undercut any claim that you're acting under undue influence. You're acting under evidence. But we don't show our hand until we have to. Wednesday, I said. Wednesday, 10 a.m., my office. Bring your ID and don't be late. I hung up and sat in the chair. Through the office glass, I could see Ray pulling a sedan onto the lift in Bay 1, the hydraulics whining as the car rose. The shop smelled like it always did, oil and metal, and the faint sweetness of the hand cleaner we kept by the sink. I'd built this place with borrowed money and 16-hour days, and now my own son was trying to take it through a courtroom because I'd had the nerve to stop writing checks. I worked the rest of Monday and all of Tuesday without mentioning it to anyone. I changed brake pads on a minivan. I quoted a timing belt job for a woman who drove in from Aurora. I ate lunch in the break room and read the sports section and pretended that Wednesday wasn't sitting at the end of the week like a wall I was walking toward. Tuesday evening around 6:30, Ray's truck pulled into my driveway. He got out carrying a pizza box and a paper bag with 2 bottles of beer poking out the top. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up. We sat on the front porch. The September air had turned cool enough that I could feel it on my forearms, and the street was quiet. Dorothy's lights were on. Next door, a dog barked 2 houses down. The last daylight sat low and orange on the rooflines of Wheatfield Drive. Ray handed me a beer and opened the pizza box between us on the porch railing. Pepperoni. The cheese was still hot enough to string when I pulled a slice. Ray and I sat on the porch eating pizza, like two mechanics at the end of a shift. Except the machine we were trying to fix was my family, and some of the parts couldn't be ordered anymore. We talked about the shop for a while. The Kendall County fleet contract was going well. A new customer had brought in a vintage Bronco that Ray was excited about. Small things, normal things. The kind of conversation you have when the big things are too heavy to pick up first. Then Ray set his beer on the railing and looked at me. "Boss, are you scared?" he said. "Of losing them." Nobody had asked me that. Not Jerry, not Dorothy, not Kieran, not Lori. Everyone had asked what I was going to do, how much I knew what the next legal move was. Nobody had looked at me and asked the only question that actually mattered, whether the man behind the strategy was afraid. "I lost them a long time ago, Ray," I said. "Tomorrow I'll just sign the papers confirming that." Ray nodded. He picked his beer back up and took a long pull and looked out at the street. "For what it's worth," he said, "you're not losing everybody." I looked at him. 45 years old, grease under his nails, a man who'd paid my son's debt from his own account and never asked for credit. Ray Gutierrez wasn't family by blood, but he was family by choice, and in that moment on the porch with the pizza getting cold and the streetlights clicking on, I understood that the second kind might be the only kind that holds. We finished eating. Ray collected the box and the bottles and carried them to his truck. He shook my hand at the curb-firm brief, the handshake of a man who'd said what he came to say. After his taillights had turned the corner, I stood at the porch railing and looked at the house. Every window, every brick. 35 years of birthdays and arguments and homework at the kitchen table, and Peggy's voice calling from the back door. Tomorrow I'd sign papers that would redraw the map of this family forever. I walked inside, stopped at the hallway shelf, and touched Peggy's photo with my thumb, the way I always did when I passed it. "I'll sign tomorrow, Peggy," I whispered. "I hope I do it right." Wednesday morning I drove into the city with Peggy's letter in my shirt pocket, and the feeling that everything I was about to do had been set in motion by a woman who'd been dead for 3 years. The pen Jerry placed on the conference table was a Mont Blanc that had belonged to his father. He only brought it out for documents that mattered. I picked it up and felt the weight of it solid, balanced heavy in a way that felt exactly right for what I was about to sign. Jerry's conference room on the 17th floor looked out over the Chicago River, gray and slow in the morning light. 2 witnesses sat at the far end of the table, paralegals from Jerry's firm, both in dark suits, both quiet. Jerry stood across from me with the document open to the signature page and read the final terms aloud. 40% into an irrevocable trust for Alara, managed independently until she turned 20% to the Margaret Kowalski Scholarship Fund at the Naperville Community Foundation. 25% reserved for my lifetime use. The remaining 15% was conditional. Kieran was eligible immediately. Garrison was eligible if he maintained sobriety for 2 consecutive years, and Lori was eligible based on demonstrated actions over time. Then Jerry read the exclusion clause. Brennan Kowalski and Roxanne Kowalski Prescott are hereby excluded from all distributions, bequests, and benefits under this instrument. He looked up from the page. "Last chance to change your mind, Vince. 40% to an 8-year-old girl who drew family portraits without her own parents in them. 20% to a scholarship in the name of a woman who spent her last 3 weeks alive writing a letter to save her husband from himself. I didn't need a last chance. I needed a pen. Peggy told me to let them be strong, I said. This is what strong looks like. I signed. The Mont Blanc moved across the page in a line that didn't waver. The witnesses signed after me. Jerry notarized it, slid the document into a manila envelope, and locked it in his office safe. When will Brennan know? Jerry asked. When I want him to know. I drove home on I-290 with the windows cracked and the September air coming through cool and sharp. The skyline shrank in the mirrors and the suburbs opened up around me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness exactly, but the specific relief of having done the thing you've been afraid to do and finding that the world is still turning afterward. Thursday. I went to the shop and worked like any other day. Brake job in Bay 1. Alignment check in Bay 3. Ray and I ate sandwiches at lunch without discussing anything heavier than the weather. I was under a Civic at 2:30 when the shop phone rang, and Ray brought it to me in the bay. It's a woman, he said. Says she's your daughter-in-law, Christine Kowalski. Brennan's 35-year-old wife, an interior designer who worked with Gold Coast condos and spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of someone who'd grown up around money and never quite lost the habit of expecting it. 3 weeks ago, she'd left me a voicemail cold enough to frost the phone. Now her voice was different, softer, unsure in a way I'd never heard from her. Dad, she said. And the word itself was a surprise. Christine usually called me by my first name, or avoided direct address entirely. I need to talk to you about Ilara. I wiped my hands on the shop rag and leaned against the fender of the Civic. I'm listening. She asked me yesterday why Grandpa doesn't talk to us anymore. She asked 3 times. I didn't know what to say. A pause. I told her you were busy, and she said Grandpa's always busy, but he always calls back. And I couldn't argue with that because she's right. You always called back. 2 weeks ago, Christine had threatened me over a voicemail. Today she was asking me to be a grandfather, and the difference between those 2 calls was an 8-year-old girl who wouldn't stop asking questions. I don't want her growing up thinking this is how families work, Christine said. Whatever is happening between you and Brennan, and I know more about it than he thinks I do, Ilara doesn't deserve to lose her grandfather over it. Brennan doesn't know you're calling, does he? I said. No, and I'd like to keep it that way, at least for now. I closed my eyes and listened to the shop around me, the pneumatic wrench cycling in Bay 2, the radio playing something by the Eagles, the sound of Ray rolling a tool cart across concrete. This woman had been part of the problem 3 weeks ago. Now she was offering something none of my own children had offered: access to the one person in this family who still loved without conditions. Bring Ilara Saturday, I said. Just bring her. Saturday, Christine repeated. Morning. Morning is fine. I'll be home. She thanked me quietly, the way people thank you when they know they're asking for more than they've earned, and hung up. I handed the phone back to Ray and slid under the Civic again, but I didn't pick up the wrench. I just lay there on the creeper, looking at the undercarriage of a car I'd been fixing for a stranger, thinking about the granddaughter I'd been missing for 3 weeks. After the shop closed, I drove home, ate reheated soup standing at the counter, and sat in the living room with the television off. Christine was bringing Ilara Saturday. Brennan didn't know. The will was signed and locked in Jerry's safe. And somewhere in this mess, the person I'd expected least had chosen the right side, not because it was strategic or profitable, but because a little girl's question was harder to ignore than a husband's pride. I reached into my shirt pocket and touched the folded edge of Peggy's letter. She's coming Saturday, Peggy, I said. Ilara's coming. Christine's silver Audi pulled into the driveway Saturday morning at 10, and before the engine stopped, the passenger door flew open and Ilara Kowalski was running. She didn't come to the front door. She ran past it around the side of the house straight toward the garden, like she already knew exactly where she needed to be. Brennan's 8-year-old daughter had brown eyes that missed nothing and a voice full of questions that hadn't stopped since she'd learned to talk. I came around the corner and found her standing in front of Peggy's tomato plants with her sneakers in the dirt, looking up at me with an expression that broke something open in my chest I'd spent 3 weeks trying to keep shut. Grandpa, she said, your tomatoes are huge. They are, I said. You want to pick some? She picked tomatoes for 20 minutes. She asked about the soil and the water, and whether the plants had names. She asked why the fence had a crack in it, and whether the hose was heavy, and if the birds that sat on the power line ever came down to eat the tomatoes. She asked about the sunflowers along the back wall. 3 of them volunteers that had come up on their own this year, and I told her they were Grandma Peggy's favorite, because she said they always looked like they were trying to find somebody to smile at. What was Grandma Peggy's laugh like? Elara asked. Loud, I said. Louder than you'd expect. She laughed with her whole body. Did she sing when she watered the garden? She did. Mostly Fleetwood Mac. Sometimes she made up songs about the tomatoes. Did you dance in the kitchen? I looked at this child standing in the dirt, with tomato juice on her fingers, and I told her the truth. We did. Every Sunday morning while the coffee was brewing. Your grandmother led because I have 2 left feet. For 2 hours, my granddaughter asked me questions nobody else had thought to ask in 4 years. What Peggy looked like when she was young, whether the tomatoes grew better, when you talked to them, if I ever got scared at night in the house alone. She asked with the honest curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand that adults stop asking things because they're afraid of the answers. Christine helped in the kitchen. She washed dishes that didn't need washing and wiped counters that were already clean, and every few minutes she looked through the window over the sink to watch her daughter in the garden with me. At one point, she stood in the doorway and said quietly enough that Elara couldn't hear. She's been asking about you for weeks, Dad. Every night at bedtime. She says, when can we go see Grandpa? And I keep saying soon, and she keeps saying you always say soon. Do you miss her every day? Elara asked me later, sitting on the porch steps eating a peanut butter sandwich I'd made. She meant Peggy. Every single day, I said. Maybe we could visit more so you won't be so lonely. I couldn't answer that right away. I ate my sandwich and looked at the garden and let the sentence sit between us like a gift I didn't know how to unwrap. Around 3 o'clock, Elara went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a set of colored pencils Christine had brought in her bag. She drew for 15 minutes with the focus of someone performing surgery, her tongue pressed against her upper lip, her hand moving in short, decisive strokes. When she finished, she held the paper up. I drew our family grandpa, she said. From today, I took the drawing. 6 stick figures standing in a garden green, scribbles at their feet. Me in the center, taller than the rest, with gray hair she'd drawn as little lines sticking up. Elara beside me holding what appeared to be a tomato. Christine on the other side, smaller, with a yellow triangle for a dress. 3 more figures. I expected Brennan. I expected Roxanne. She'd drawn 5 stick figures around me, and not one of them was her father. The other 3 were labeled in careful, wobbly letters. One said, Kieran spelled the way an 8-year-old would. One said Ray with a wrench in his hand. And one said Dorothy with a hat. Who are these 2? I asked, pointing to Ray and Dorothy. That's the man at your shop who Mom says is nice, Elara said, pointing at Ray. And that's the lady next door who waves at me from the garden. Christine was standing behind me. I heard her breath catch a small sound, the kind you make when something lands in a place you weren't protecting. She drew it from what she knows, Dad, Christine said quietly. What she knew. An 8-year-old had drawn the family she'd actually experienced, not the family on paper, not the family tree, not the people who shared a last name or a checking account. She'd drawn the people who showed up. Ray, who fixed things. Dorothy, who waved. Kieran, who called. Christine, who brought her here. And me standing in the middle of a garden that Peggy had planted, and I'd kept alive because it was the only way I knew to keep talking to her. Brennan wasn't in the picture. Roxanne wasn't in the picture. Garrison wasn't in the picture. My 3 eldest children had been erased not by malice, not by strategy, but by an 8-year-old's honest observation of who was actually present in her grandfather's life. Christine left around 4. Elara hugged me at the door, tight both arms, her face pressed against my stomach because she wasn't tall enough to reach my chest, and said, "Next time, can we make pasta sauce with the tomatoes?" "Next time," I said. "I promise." After they drove away, I stood in the kitchen and pinned Alara's drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet Peggy had bought at a craft fair 15 years ago. 6 stick figures and a garden. No Brennan, no Roxanne, no Garrison. An 8-year-old had drawn my real family with colored pencils on a Saturday afternoon, and she'd gotten it exactly right. Alara's drawing stayed on the refrigerator all weekend. I'd pass it on the way to the coffee maker and stop every time to look at the stick figures, the people she'd chosen, the people she'd left out. By Monday morning, I'd stopped being surprised by it. I'd started being armed by it. Brennan came through the door without knocking the way he always did, jaw set, and shoulders squared like a man entering a negotiation he expected to win. He was wearing a suit, not the office kind, but the kind you wear when you want someone to know you dressed for the occasion. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me sitting at the table with my coffee, and I could see the script running behind his eyes. "You've removed me from the will," he said. "Your own son." "Yes, because I forgot a birthday party." "No." He pulled out a chair and sat down. He didn't ask for coffee. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread the posture of a man presenting a case. "Dad, I understand you're angry. I understand we dropped the ball on the party. But rewriting your entire estate over a dinner at Maggiano's is not rational behavior. Hargrove says, I don't care what Hargrove says. Hargrove says this kind of sudden change combined with isolation and age fits the textbook definition of Brennan." I set my mug down. The ceramic clicked against the table. "Stop talking about Hargrove. I want to talk about March 14th. He blinked. The script stalled. "You met Jerry Ashworth on March 14th of this year," I said. "Your mother's death anniversary. You walked into his office without an appointment and asked about voluntary guardianship and durable power of attorney for an elderly relative living alone. March 14th. He could have picked any day on the calendar to visit a lawyer about taking control of my life. He chose the anniversary of the day we buried his mother's ashes under the eucalyptus tree in the backyard. He chose the day I spend every year alone with flowers and silence and the specific weight of a grief that never gets lighter, only quieter." Brennan's hands were still on the table, but they weren't flat anymore. His fingers had curled inward just slightly, the way they used to when he was a boy caught in a lie at this same table. "Dad," he said, "I was just worried about you, living alone, making decisions without—" "You were worried about my estate, Brennan, not me. If you were worried about me, you would have called, you would have visited. You would have come to Maggiano's and sat across from me and asked how I was doing. Instead, you went to a lawyer and asked how to take legal control of a man you hadn't called in months." Silence. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Outside, a car passed on Wheatfield Drive, tires on wet pavement. It had rained overnight and the gutters were still draining. "I will contest this will," Brennan said. His voice was quieter now, but harder the way metal gets harder when you cool it too fast. "You have the right," I said. "But I want you to think about what that means. Kieran has 23 screenshots from 2023 and 2024. iMessage conversations group chat, records messages between you and Roxanne about how to time the requests around my birthday and your mother's death anniversary. He's had them for over a year." Brennan's jaw moved, but no sound came out. "And Jerry has your mother's letter," I continued. 3 pages written 3 weeks before she died. She described exactly what each of you would do, and so far, she's been right about all of it. If this goes to court, all of it becomes public record. The screenshots, the letter, the group chat. Every message in the no dad zone. The name landed like a slap. He flinched not much, but enough for me to see it. He hadn't known I knew. My son stood in the kitchen where his mother used to cook Sunday dinners and calculated whether to fight or fold, and behind him on the refrigerator, His own daughter's drawing didn't include him. You named it, I said. All of you. You named the place where you planned how to take from me. You called it the no-dad zone like it was a joke. It wasn't. It doesn't matter what it was. It matters what it is. And what it is, Brennan, is evidence. Documented, time-stamped screenshot evidence that your family coordinated to exploit me financially while I was grieving your mother. A judge won't see an overreacting old man. A judge will see a pattern. Brennan stood up. The chair didn't scrape. This time he pushed it back slowly, deliberately, the way a man exits a room when he knows he's lost but isn't ready to say it. This isn't over, he said. I know it isn't. But the terms have changed. He walked to the front door and stopped. He didn't turn around. The glass panel in the door caught his reflection. Suit-set jaw, hands at his sides. But something in the reflection was different from the man who'd walked in 40 minutes ago. The shoulders were lower. The chin wasn't up. For the first time in 37 years, my eldest son looked like a man who had run out of moves. I sat at the table and listened to his car start in the driveway. The engine idled for a long time, 30 seconds, maybe more, before he backed out. I imagined him sitting behind the wheel, staring at the house, trying to calculate his next move the way he calculated everything. But some things can't be calculated. Some things just have to be felt. Behind me on the refrigerator, Ilara's drawing watched the empty kitchen. 6 stick figures standing in a garden. Grandpa in the center. Ray with a wrench. Dorothy with a hat. Kieran, Christine, and Ilara herself. 5 people and a child. No Brennan. No Roxanne. No Garrison. An 8-year-old had seen what it took me 60 years to understand family isn't who you're related to. It's who shows up. Brennan didn't file the contest that week or the week after. The threat sat between us like an unexploded shell, still dangerous, but quieter every day. October came in cool and gray, and the world kept moving even when my family didn't. The phone rang at 2 a.m. on October 15th, and for the first time in 6 weeks of calls, the voice on the other end wasn't angry or drunk. It was sober and it was terrified. Dad. Garrison's voice was thin and clear like a wire pulled too tight. The bank took the bar today. I'm sitting in it right now. The chairs are still up on the tables from last night. The lights are off. I'm in the kitchen. Are you drunk? I asked. No. A long breath. That's what scares me. I'm sitting here completely sober and all I can think about is the bottle of Maker's Mark behind the bar that I couldn't even sell because it was already open. I'm afraid if I drink, I won't be able to stop. I was already out of bed. I'd slept in my clothes without meaning to, something I'd been doing more often since September, as if my body knew rest was temporary. Where are you exactly? I said. The kitchen. The back door is unlocked. I didn't lock it because I didn't see the point. Stay there. Don't touch the bottle. I'm coming. I drove to Berwyn in 35 minutes. The expressway empty at that hour, the city lights reflected on the wet pavement like something spilled. I found Garrison in the kitchen of the iron rail, sitting on an overturned milk crate with his hands in his lap and the Maker's Mark on the counter 3 feet away. Untouched. He'd been staring at it for an hour. I sat on the crate next to him. The kitchen smelled like old fryer grease and the industrial cleaner they used on the floors, and somewhere in the dining room a cooler motor was still running, keeping nothing cold for nobody. I don't know what to do, Dad, he said. I know. I don't mean about the bar, I mean about me. We sat there until the first light came through the kitchen window. Gray thin, the kind of October dawn that doesn't commit to being morning until it's already happened. Then I drove him to Hines 5, a hospital in Maywood. The building sat back from the road, behind a lawn that was starting to turn brown, and at the admissions gate, Garrison stopped walking. I sat in the Hines parking lot, watching my son walk through those doors. And I realized this was the first time in 32 years I'd helped him without writing a check. "I'll be here, Garrison," I said through the open car window. "Not when you call. I'll be here." He nodded. He didn't look back. The doors closed behind him with a sound like an exhale, and I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with the engine running, watching the building hold my son in a way I never could. The second call came 4 days later, mid-October, a Thursday afternoon, and Kieran's name lit up my phone while I was at the shop. "Grandpa, she posted again," he said. His voice was flat in the way voices get when someone has already made a decision and is looking for the last reason not to reverse it. 8 minutes this time. TikTok. She's crying on camera, talking about how her father abandoned the family and how the holidays will never be the same. 1.2 million views in 24 hours. I didn't say anything. I let him talk. "Am I going to post the screenshots, Grandpa?" "That's your decision, Kieran. I'm not asking you to do it. But if you do, make sure you're ready for what comes after." Silence on the line. I could hear the faint hum of his dorm room, a fan or a heater, the white noise of a 22-year-old's life. Then he said, "I'm ready," and hung up. She built a life performing for strangers online, and a stranger's algorithm destroyed it in 6 hours. But the person who lit the match was her own 22-year-old son, and that's a kind of justice nobody celebrates. Kieran called back that evening. His voice was different now, not flat, but fragile, carrying the weight of something he'd done that couldn't be undone. 2.3 million views, Grandpa. 6 hours. She lost 41,000 followers. The skincare brand deal, $18,000. They canceled the contract this afternoon. Her agent called twice. He paused. Brett called me. Threatened to sue. Said I'd never see Alara again. I told him the screenshots were already cached on 3 different sites, and deleting the original wouldn't change anything. Another pause, longer this time. And then Mom called. She didn't yell. She just said, "You're not my son anymore," and hung up. "Kieran, Mom blocked me, Grandpa." His voice cracked on the word. "On everything. Phone, Instagram, all of it. I can't even see her page anymore. Are you okay?" The question hung in the air between Naperville and Champaign, across 100 miles of expressway and farmland, and the invisible distance between a young man who'd just traded his mother's love for his grandfather's truth. "I'm okay," he said quietly. "Just sad." After he hung up, I sat in the dark kitchen with Alara's drawing on the refrigerator and Peggy's letter in my shirt pocket. The house was silent, except for the tick of the hallway clock and the sound of my own breathing. One son was in a VA hospital in Maywood, learning how to live without a crutch. One grandson was in a dorm room in Champaign, learning what it costs to do the right thing. And somewhere in Scottsdale, my daughter's carefully built world was burning down from the inside out, not because a stranger exposed her, but because her own child chose the truth over her approval. I touched Peggy's letter through my shirt. 3 pages of a dead woman's wisdom still warm against my chest. "This is the part you warned me about, Peggy," I said to the empty room. "The part where it hurts everybody." The weeks after Kieran's post were the quietest of my life. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a battlefield after the shooting stops and nobody's sure yet who's still standing. Garrison was in Hines. Roxanne had gone silent. Brennan hadn't called. And I went to the shop every morning because engines don't care about your family. Jerry Ashworth had been my lawyer for 11 years, but I'd never heard him sound disappointed by winning. "Hargrove filed the withdrawal this morning," he said when he called the first week of November. "The will contest is dead." Brennan pulled the plug. "Miho swung." "Why now?" "Because the screenshots would have gone into the public record during discovery. Depositions exhibits all of it. Kieran's evidence, the group chat messages, your mother's letter, every piece of it would have been filed with the court and accessible to anyone. Brennan couldn't risk that. Not with his position at Harrington, not with Christine's family connections. So we won, I said. Jerry paused. Nobody wins in this, Vince. He was right. The contest was dead, but the family it was built from wasn't breathing much either. I thanked Jerry and hung up and went back to a brake job in Bay 2 because brake jobs have answers and families don't. 3 days later, Lori showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door and found her standing on the porch in the November cold, no coat heavy enough for the temperature, her car parked at the curb with the engine still running, like she wasn't sure she'd be staying long enough to turn it off. I drove here from DeKalb, she said. 3 hours. I didn't call first because I was afraid you'd say no. Peggy used to say, trust is a house you build one brick at a time and burn down with one match. But she never said what happens when someone shows up with mortar and no blueprint. Come inside, I said. We sat at the kitchen table. I made her tea chamomile again from the same box. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from any of my children in months direct. No script, no performance. Just a 29-year-old woman sitting across from her father, trying to figure out where the floor was. Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest, she said. Am I still in the will? I appreciated the directness. After months of coded language and legal maneuvering and voicemails that said everything except what they meant, a straight question felt like clean water. That depends on you, Lori. Not on what you say today, on what you do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the month after that. She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She sipped her tea and sat with it, and when she left 20 minutes later, she hugged me at the door, brief, careful, the hug of someone who knows they haven't earned the full version yet, but is willing to work toward it. Thanksgiving approached the way it does every year, slowly, and then all at once. I wasn't planning anything. Dorothy had invited me to eat with her and her sister, and I'd said yes because the alternative was heating a turkey breast for one and pretending that was a celebration. Then 3 days before the holiday, someone knocked on the front door. Actually knocked 2 raps measured and deliberate. Brennan stood on the porch. No suit, no briefcase, no Christine beside him, and no lawyer's confidence propping up his shoulders. He was wearing a flannel shirt I'd never seen before, and jeans, and he looked older than 37. Thinner in the face. His eyes had the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been arguing with himself for weeks and lost. I didn't bring anyone, he said. No lawyer, no Christine, just me. I can see that. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the doorframe. The way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to walk through anymore. He was 37 years old, and this was the first time he'd ever stood on my porch without wanting something, or at least the first time he stood there willing to admit he didn't know what he wanted. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. He walked to the kitchen slower than usual, no clicking shoes on the hardwood, just socks because he'd taken his boots off at the door, without being asked, which he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He sat at the table in the chair he always sat in, the one with the wobbly leg that I'd never fixed, because Peggy said it gave the table character. I can't remember the last time I called you just to talk, he said. Not about the shop, not about money, not about anything with a $sign attached. Just to say, hey Dad, how's it going? He looked at his hands. You asked me to write that date on a piece of paper 2 months ago, and I couldn't do it. I've been thinking about that blank paper every day since. He paused. The kitchen was quiet. November light came through the window over the sink, pale and thin. If you gave me that blank paper again right now and told me to write down what I actually want, not what I think I should want, not what Christine wants, not what the job demands, I think I'd have to sit there a long time. Because I don't know anymore, Dad. I honestly don't know. I looked at my eldest son. The salesman was gone. The negotiator was gone. What was left was a man sitting at his mother's kitchen table, admitting he'd lost the plot of his own life, and that admission cost him more than any check I'd ever written. I didn't say anything for a while. I let the silence hold us the way Peggy used to hold a conversation patiently without rushing toward a resolution. Then I said, "Does Alara want to plant some trees?" Brennan looked up. Something moved across his face, not understanding exactly, but the beginning of it. He pulled out his phone and called someone. I heard it ring twice before a small voice answered. "Hey," he said. "Dad wants to know if Alara wants to plant some trees." Brennan and Alara came the Saturday after Thanksgiving. They dug 6 holes in the frozen yard for saplings that wouldn't arrive until spring, and Alara wore pink gardening gloves she'd picked out herself. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a shovel in the dirt. But it was something. January came in hard wind off the lake ice on the expressway, the kind of Illinois cold that makes your joints remember every year you've carried. I was underneath a '91 F-150 at the shop on a Tuesday morning, replacing a rusted fuel line when the phone rang. Ray brought it to me in the bay. The voice on the other end was so steady, I almost didn't recognize my own son. "Dad," Garrison said, "I'm doing the 9th step, amends. You're the first person on my list. You don't have to." "Yeah, I do." 3 months at Heinz had done something to his voice that 32 years of living hadn't. The urgency was gone. The shake was gone. What was left was a man speaking from a place that sounded like solid ground. "There's a guy in my group," he said. 68 years old. Vietnam vet. Been sober 19 years. Last week he told us something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said the person who loves you most is the one who says no to you. Everyone else is just keeping you comfortable. Garrison paused. I sat in that circle and thought about you, Dad. About every time you wrote a check, and every time I cashed it, and every time I told myself I'd pay it back even though we both knew I wouldn't. And then I thought about the night you drove me to Heinz and said you'd be there. Not when I called. Just there. I slid out from under the truck and sat on the creeper with my back against the rear tire, the concrete cold through my coveralls. Ray was working in Bay 3, and the radio was playing something I couldn't hear over the sound of my own breathing. If you've ever waited 3 months for a phone call you weren't sure was coming, you know the strange thing isn't the relief. It's realizing you'd already started grieving someone who was still alive. "I'm sorry, Dad," Garrison said. "For the money, for the lying, for standing on your porch drunk and blaming you for something I built with my own hands, for using Mom's name like a weapon." "How long have you been sober?" I asked. 94 days. "When you get out of there," I said, "I'm taking you for pho. That place on Cermak you liked when you were 12. He laughed. A real laugh, not the nervous kind or the performing kind. The laugh of a man who remembered something small and good. "I was 12, he said. "I thought I was 14. "You were 12. I remember because you spilled broth on your Bulls jersey, and Peggy made you wear your coat backward the whole way home." He laughed again, and this time it cracked at the edges, and I could hear him covering the phone so I wouldn't hear the rest of it. I let him. Some things don't need witnesses. After we hung up, I sat on the creeper in Bay 1 for 10 minutes. Ray came over and leaned against the workbench and didn't say anything because Ray had always known when to speak and when to just stand nearby. Then I went to the bathroom, closed the door, and cried the way I'd cried over Peggy's letter, hard, fast, and only once. 3 weeks later, Kieran called. It was a Sunday evening and I was at the kitchen table eating leftover soup, and his voice had the flat, careful tone of someone delivering news they'd already processed, but hadn't decided how to feel about. "Brett's real estate deal fell through," he said. "That strip mall project in Tempe. He leveraged the Scottsdale house to finance it, and the deal collapsed. They're listing the house. $410,000. The Scottsdale house was a monument built on borrowed money and borrowed time, and now both debts had come due on the same afternoon. "You know where some of that down payment came from, Grandpa?" Kieran said. I knew. Some of the money I'd transferred over the past 2 years, the grocery requests, The emergency funds had flowed through Roxanne to Brett and into real estate ventures I'd never been told about. The house they'd lived in, the house they'd posted sunset photos from, the house they'd been staying in the night they skipped my birthday part of it, was built on my account. "How's your mother?" I asked. She still won't talk to me. But I check her page. She's down to posting twice a week. No brand tags. No sponsored content. I think she's embarrassed. He paused. She lost 2 more deals last month. The skincare thing was just the beginning. "Are you glad?" The question sat between us for a long time. "No," Kieran said. "I still love my mom, grandpa." There it was. 22 years old, living in a dorm room the size of my bathroom, blocked by his own mother on every platform that existed. And he was saying the words that none of my adult children had managed to say through this entire ordeal, that love doesn't stop because someone hurts you, and admitting it out loud is harder than any screenshot or legal filing or blank piece of paper on a kitchen table. "Kieran," I said, "that's the first time anyone said that to me. Not that they loved somebody, that they admitted it even when it hurt." After I hung up, I walked to the back window and looked at the yard. The 6 holes Brennan and Alara had dug in November were still there, shallow craters in the frozen ground, evenly spaced along the back fence where Peggy's garden used to end. The saplings hadn't arrived yet. The ground was too hard to plant anything until April. But on the porch railing, a pair of small pink gardening gloves sat exactly where Alara had left them, frozen stiff, dusted with frost, waiting for spring the way everything in this family was waiting. Not healed, not finished, just still here. Spring came the way it always does in Illinois, late, reluctant, and all at once. The pink gloves came off the porch railing in April, when Alara and Brennan planted the saplings in the 6 holes they'd dug in November. I watched from the kitchen window while they worked. Nobody asked me to come outside. I went anyway. But before the trees, there was February. The new EV lift cost $11,000, and it was the first check I'd written in 2 years that felt like building something instead of losing it. Ray managed the installation while I spent a week at a training center in Schaumburg, learning how to service electric drivetrains. 60 years old, sitting in a classroom with technicians half my age, taking notes in the same ruled notepad where I'd once categorized my children's voicemails. "You're 60 years old and learning a new trade," Ray said, watching the lift go in. 60-year-olds who stop learning become 60-year-olds who stop," I said. The shop felt different after that. Not just the equipment, the energy. We picked up 3 fleet accounts in March. A dealership in Aurora started sending us their overflow. Ray hired a young mechanic named Cole, who knew more about battery management systems than either of us. And for the first time in years, the shop felt like it was moving forward instead of just holding on. I enrolled in piano lessons at the Naperville Music Academy. Peggy's upright had sat in the living room untouched for 4 years, lid closed, a thin layer of dust on the keys that I'd never wiped, because wiping it felt like admitting she wasn't coming back to play it. The instructor was patient. I was terrible. But my fingers moved on the keys, and the house had music in it again. And some nights I'd sit at the bench after practice and play the same 3 chords over and over just to hear something that wasn't silence. At a woodworking club in Naperville, I met Harold Freeman. 64, retired history teacher, widowed 2 years. He had thick hands and a quiet way of speaking that reminded me of the men I'd served with at Fort Campbell, guys who said less than they knew and knew more than they let on. We stood at adjacent workbenches, sanding walnut boards, and talked about dovetail joints and grain direction, and somewhere between the sawdust and the varnish smell, we became friends. When did I become the kind of man who needed a retired stranger with a belt sander to remind me that silence between 2 people doesn't have to mean someone's keeping score? My wife used to say I'd outlive her just to have the garage to myself, Harold said one evening. Mine said I'd outlive her because I was too stubborn to go first. Were they right? About everything. In May, Kieran graduated from UIUC. I drove 2 hours and 11 minutes without telling anyone I was coming and stood in the back row of the ceremony with my hands in my jacket pockets, watching my grandson walk across a stage he'd earned with scholarships and weekend grocery shifts and a year of carrying evidence he never should have had to carry. When he spotted me afterward in the crowd, his face did something I'll remember for the rest of my life, surprise first, then a grin so wide it looked like it hurt. "Grandpa, you drove 2 hours. 2 hours and 11 minutes. Your grandmother would have made me leave at 4 in the morning." He hugged me, graduation cap still on gown unzipped, surrounded by strangers who had no idea that the old man in the back row was the reason this kid had learned the difference between love and leverage. Then came June. I packed a bag, drove to O'Hare, and flew to Dublin alone. I'd found the folder in Peggy's nightstand, 6 months after she died, 17 pages of printouts, hotels in Cork, ferry schedules to the islands, a handwritten note in her careful script. Ask about the Kowalski name at the parish office. She'd been planning a trip for us to Skibbereen, the village in County Cork, where her grandparents had left during the famine. She'd researched everything. She'd bookmarked the church, the harbor, the stone wall where the memorial plaques were. She'd made reservations at a bed and breakfast that had since closed. She'd planned this trip for both of us. I just never made the time. I rented a car at Dublin Airport and drove south for 4 hours through green that doesn't exist in Illinois. Deep, wet, layered green that covered everything like paint. Skibbereen sat at the end of a road that narrowed twice a small town, with colored storefronts and a river running through the center, and a sky that couldn't decide between rain and light. I'd crossed an ocean to stand in a village my wife never got to see, holding a folder of plans she'd made for both of us, and the only thing I could think was that she would have packed an umbrella and I hadn't. I found the church. Gray stone iron gate, a graveyard with names worn smooth by 200 years of Atlantic weather. I stood outside with the folder in my hand, and the wind coming off the harbor, cold and salt-smelling, pressing against my jacket. I picked a wildflower from the grass beside the wall, small, purple, nameless, and set it on the ground near the gate. "Peggy, I'm here," I said. "I'm sorry I'm late, but I'm here." No response. Just wind off the harbor, and the sound of a gate swinging on its hinge, and the distant cry of a gull over water she'd dreamed about, but never touched. I stayed until the light went gray. On the walk back to the rental car, I passed a pub with a chalkboard sign outside that read, "All are welcome who come honest." I took a photo and sent it to 4 people, Garrison, Laurie, Kieran, and Brennan. 3 of them replied within the hour. 1 didn't, but he'd read it. Kieran's cake leaned 11 degrees to the left, and the frosting said, "Happy Birthday," in Alara's handwriting, missing the second P entirely, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in a year. 3 of the 4 people I'd texted from that Skibbereen pub had replied within the hour. The 4th read it and stayed silent. I'd stopped measuring my children by their silences sometime around spring, and by September the habit had mostly stuck. Alara carried the cake through the kitchen door, with both hands, tongue pressed between her teeth, like she was diffusing a bomb. Kieran walked behind her with his palms hovering underneath in case the whole thing collapsed. Christine followed with a foil-covered casserole and set it on the counter without once mentioning her husband's name. The kitchen smelled like buttercream and whatever Christine had put rosemary into, and for a moment, the house felt the way it used to feel when Peggy would cook for 12 on a Wednesday just because she felt like it. "Grandpa, how old are you?" Alara asked, setting the cake on the table with a thud that sent a crack through the frosting's why. 61. "Is that a lot?" Harold Freeman looked up from across the table, where he'd been arguing with Ray about something I'd already lost track of. "Ask me that question, sweetheart. I'm 64. That's a lot." Dorothy arrived next with a card. She said the whole block had signed, though I suspected she'd done most of the signing herself based on how similar the handwriting looked. She set a bottle of lemonade on the counter and kissed my cheek and told me I looked thin, which is what Dorothy has told me every Saturday since 1994, regardless of my actual weight. Ray and Harold had been at it for 20 minutes by then. Cubs versus White Sox, the eternal argument that neither of them actually cared about, but both refused to lose. You cannot sit in this man's house on his birthday and tell me the White Sox have a better rotation, Ray said, pointing a fork at Harold. I can and I will, Harold said, because it's true and because the cake is terrible and somebody has to tell the truth today. Ilara gasped. Kieran laughed so hard he choked on lemonade. Dorothy swatted Harold's arm with the birthday card. If you're waiting for the part where all 4 of my children sit at one table and apologize in unison, that's not this story, because that's not how it works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What I had instead was 7 people in a kitchen that seats 6 arguing about baseball and eating a cake that tasted like baking soda and love, and not one of them shared my last name by birth. Kieran was a Prescott. Christine had married into it. Ray, Dorothy, Harold, they were here because they chose to be on a Saturday, for no reason at all except that they wanted to be. The doorbell didn't ring. Garrison just knocked 3 soft knocks the way someone knocks when they're not sure they've earned the right to use a doorbell. I opened it, and he stood in the doorway holding a 4-pack of sparkling water, looking thinner than the last time I'd seen him, and steadier than any time before that. Am I late? You're right on time. I brought sparkling water. He held it up like evidence. 8 months. I know, come inside. He stepped in, and Ilara ran to him before he could set the water down. He picked her up with one arm, and she told him his hair was too long, and he told her she was probably right. Ray shook his hand. Harold said, "Welcome back," without making it heavy. Dorothy poured him a glass of his own sparkling water, and he drank it standing at the counter watching the room like he was memorizing it. After the cake, which was, Harold was correct, objectively terrible, Ilara asked for paper and crayons. She sat on the living room floor and drew for 15 minutes while the adults talked about nothing important. When she finished, she walked to the refrigerator and taped the new drawing next to the one from her first visit, the one with 6 stick figures. This one had 10. I counted them twice. She'd added Dorothy with her glasses, Ray with a wrench, Harold with a book, and Garrison standing slightly apart, but still in the frame. I didn't say anything. I just looked at it until Christine told Ilara it was time to go, and the kitchen started emptying. The way kitchens do, coats found leftovers wrapped, goodbyes stretched across the porch in the cooling air. A year ago, I had a joint checking account with over $100,000 that wasn't really mine. 4 children who called only when they needed something, and a dead wife whose garden I couldn't look at. Now I had a porch, a cup of tea, and the knowledge that 7 people had chosen to spend a Saturday afternoon with me for no reason except that they wanted to. By 10, the house was quiet. I sat on the front porch with chamomile going cold in my hands and listened to Wheatfield Drive settle into night. A dog barked somewhere past the Hendersons' place. A car door closed 3 houses over. My phone buzzed once on the railing. One message. Brennan. Happy birthday, Dad. I'm working on it. I stared at those 6 words for a long time. Working on what exactly, he didn't say. The blank paper I'd put in front of him months ago had come back around in a different shape, not an answer yet, but an admission that the question still existed, that the door I'd opened was still open, that he knew where it was even if he hadn't walked through it. I typed 2 words back, I know. Then I set the phone face down on the railing and looked at the yard. Peggy's eucalyptus had grown past the roofline sometime during the summer, its branches brushing the gutters when the wind picked up. She'd planted it in 2003, the year Garrison was born, and it had outlasted almost everything else she'd put in the ground. The garden was full again now, Ilara's roses, the herbs I'd started in July, the jasmine climbing the fence, all of it growing in the dark. I sat there until the streetlights clicked on one by one down Wheatfield Drive. Inside, Alara's new drawing hung on the refrigerator beside the old one. 5 stick figures next to 10. The eucalyptus swayed against the roof, still growing, and the phone on the railing stayed quiet. Not empty quiet. Finished quiet. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent decades writing checks and keeping the peace and calling it love. I let my own children treat me like an open register because I was afraid that saying no meant losing them. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until your 60th birthday sitting alone at a table set for 6 to realize that silence from the people you raised is not peace. It is a warning. Family justice doesn't always look the way you expect. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. Sometimes family justice is a quiet decision made at a kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, choosing yourself for the first time in 30 years. I learned that protecting your peace is not cruelty. It is the most honest kind of love you can offer, because it tells the people around you that you matter too. I believe God put me through that year, the empty birthday, the bank statements, the courtroom threats, and the long silence so I could stand on the other side and tell you the people who belong in your life will find their way back without being bribed. Family justice starts the moment you stop paying for loyalty and start earning it on both sides. If this story moved you, or if it reminded you of something you've been carrying, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments, would you have done what I did, or would you have handled it differently? If someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to His Revenge so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. The lesson, that is what I hope you carry with you.